Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about our seven views or 7 viewpoints approach to process modeling. I'm going to introduce the process ontology, so the terms and the relationships between them that we use when we talk about process modeling. Now, again, as with all of these kinds of approaches, you have to remember this is the language that we use, and this is our sort of basic version of the framework. If you take it to adopt it, you can change the names of things. You can add extra things, extra relationships. So just because the words might be different, it doesn't mean that that you can't use it. So you can always tailor these things. So we're going to introduce the ontology that the framework's based on. Then we'll sort of briefly introduce the 7 viewpoints, and then we'll see an example of each one, and we'll see the bit of the ontology that it covers. So, for those of you that have been along to previous talks, or those of you that have done work with us before, you'll be well aware that most everything that we do in Scarecrow, we do it based on very much on the basis of having a framework in place, which consists of an ontology, a set of terms and their relationships that are formally defined, that establishes the language that we use, and then a number of viewpoints, effectively subsets of that ontology that you are allowed to sort of put together when you're using that framework. And our approach is no different. This is our ontology here, and I'm going to concentrate at first on this sort of bit in the middle here. This is the key part there. So I'm just going to let somebody else in. So that's the key part. So process, essentially just a defined way of doing something. That's all we mean by a process. But the process is made up of 3 core concepts. And the first one is the activities that you carry out within that process. We call them activities. Some people may call them tasks or process steps, but essentially they're the small parts within a process that you carry out to achieve the aims of the process. So that's what the activities are. And then we've got the concept of artifacts, and artifacts are produced and consumed. Consumed is a slightly probably misleading name. So actually produced or used by would be a better, or in this case, sorry, uses would be a better. Try and get my eraser up. Rather than produces and uses artifacts. Consumption implies that it destroys, and it doesn't. It just means that some activities produce things, some use those things to produce other things. So the artifacts are the sort of inputs and outputs of your process and of the activities within that process. So they're the things like your design documents and review reports, and ultimately the actual system that you're building. And also associated with activities, I'm just going to come out of the central bit and down here on to resource, is the concept of the resource. Now, resources are consumed by activities, and the difference between resources and artifacts, as I say, artifacts are the things that the process is designed to produce. So a design document, an architecture, a car, a train. Resources are, the time, material, energy that are consumed in doing that. So they really are consumed. If you have a process that has to produce 500 copies of a document, it's going to produce a load of paper and toner and electricity and time. So that's what we mean by resource. They are the actual sort of consumables. And also in that central section is we've got stakeholder role. The role of a person, place, or thing. In this case, it's going to be a person ultimately. that's responsible for that activity. Now, we are sort of deliberately vague here by using the term responsible. We mean it as the person that's sort of responsible for making sure that activity is done. But there are different kinds of responsibilities, and often when we do this, for real on a real project, we actually add multiple relationships here, and we do something like a RACI or a RACIC matrix. So responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. I'll do an S first. Responsible, accountable, supporting, informed, and consulted. To distinguish between the fact that there are multiple stakeholder roles sometimes involved in an activity. So in this case, responsible would be the person that carries it out. Accountable would be the person that's ultimately, has to ensure that that activity has been done. Support are their stakeholder roles that can support people in carrying out the activity. Informed are people that have to be, or stakeholder roles that have to be informed about the result of the activity, or that the activity is actually taking place. And consulted is a little bit stronger than informed. They actually have to actively be consulted about how that activity is going to be carried out. So that single responsible for relationship could be expanded out into 4 or 5 separate relationships for the sort of different natures of that responsibility that sits in there. Also, I mentioned, artifacts are the things that are produced and consumed by the activities. That they are the sort of intentional outputs from the process. Well, how do you know what the process or a set of processes exists to do? Well, that's where we come over onto this side of the diagram and we bring in the idea of context. A context, essentially a set of use cases, a set of requirements, if you will, that define, the need for a process or a set of processes. So as well as, processes having internals, having activities, having artifacts that they produce and that they use, and having responsible stakeholders in their definition, they also have to exist for a reason. We don't just make processes up for the sake of making them up. So over on the right hand side, we've got the fact that every process is going to have a context associated with it, containing use cases, requirements, if you like, in that context that define what that process has to do. And the final thing at the top, the process group, this comes more in, not so much in the definition of processes, but you can use a lot of the concepts here in an extended way, and to extend process modeling to actual sort of life cycle modeling. And that's where the process groups come in, where you can bundle up sets of processes that are carried out in life cycles, or if you just want to sort of group or sort of related processes together, so all of your technical processes, all of your management processes. So essentially all a process group is it's just a convenient grouping of of processes. You don't necessarily have to have process groups. If you'd only got 2 or 3 processes, you probably wouldn't bother. We've had a question from Stephen. Let me just see. Why is Artefact shown as part of process, whereas resource is not a part of it? Yeah, that's an interesting question, because the artifact is an intrinsic part of the process. The artifact is an intentional, I'm not even going to say byproduct, because it's an intentional product of the process. The process exists to produce one or more artifacts. The resources just happen to be things that you need to allow you to carry out the process. they're not an intrinsic part of the process itself. You know, the fact that you've got to produce 500 copies of a document, and hence you're going to need paper, is not particularly, you know, it's not an intrinsic part of a requirements definition process. It just happens that, you know, to print onto paper, you're going to need lots of paper. So you also said activity uses Artefact. Yes, I did. Yeah, that's correct. And like I say, because what we mean by uses and produces artifacts is you may have a design process, and an input to that design process could be a requirement specification. Well, that requirement specification is produced by an activity in a requirements process, and it's used then by an activity in a design process. So the artifacts are the intentional outputs and the inputs to processes that are used and you know, provide information, provide inputs, whereas the resources are essentially just consumables. You know, if you could do stuff without consuming any power, that, you know, and without using it, then you wouldn't have any associated resources. So that's our ontology. So essentially, processes made up of stakeholder roles, activities, and artifacts. They can be grouped together if you want, but you don't have to, and they have to exist because you know, there are some requirements in context, which we call use cases, to tell you what that process or that set of processes have to exist for. Otherwise, how do you know what the process has to do, and how do you know why you need it? So that brings us then on to the other half of the framework, the actual viewpoints. Now, we generally call this the 7 views approach. And we call it the 7 views approach because there's 7 views. Technically, they are actually viewpoints. In the language of ISO 4210, they're viewpoints. They're definitions of subsets of that ontology that you produce instances of when you actually document a process. Those instances are called views. We've always stuck with 7 views because this framework of ours dates back a long time. It was the very first framework that we did over 10 years ago, and we weren't conforming to 4210, so we call them views. But more technically, it should be called the 7 viewpoints approach. But historically, we've kept the name. Just, you know, it gets too confusing otherwise. Sorry, somebody's waiting in the lobby. And so, you know, it's called the seven views or the 7 viewpoints approach because there are 7 viewpoints. So I'm going to go through each one, and we'll see which bit of the ontology the viewpoint covers, and then we'll see an example of a view now, and I do mean a view now, an actual instance of one of the viewpoints created for a real process model. It's a teaching set of processes that we developed a long time ago that we occasionally use on some of our courses, and it's an incredibly cut down version of ISO 15288, the international standard on systems and software engineering lifecycle processes. We call it STUMPI, which is Students Managing Projects Intelligently. It originally came out of work that we were doing in a number of universities. Stuff John was doing and stuff at Warwick. So the first one of the 7 views or viewpoints is the Requirement Context Viewpoint, and this is about specifying the overall aims of the process. So this is where you capture, you know, what are the requirements essentially for the process? What does the process or set of processes exist to do? And you know, we're systems engineers. You know, we should be working with requirements. We should be applying systems engineering to how we do systems engineering. So there's no surprise that if we're going to be defining processes, we need to know what the requirements are. They're essential for us to be able to validate that the processes are fit for purpose. And, if processes do need to change, sometimes processes need to change because of legislation. Sometimes processes need to change because, the business changes the way it does things. Maybe it grows or gets restructured. So it is important to know, why these processes exist and what they are meant to do for us, so that we can make sure that they are validated and we can revalidate them if necessary. So the requirement context view, essentially, it's that part of the ontology. It's about capturing, for a process or a set of processes, the context, the requirements for that process, so that we know what it has to do. And we use if we model in SysML, we'd use a use case diagram for that. So it captures the process or set of processes, and it captures the things that process must do, and it captures the stakeholders that are involved or affected by the process. So STUMPI was about defining development processes, both engineering and management processes, and the definition had to cover the activities that were carried out, the artifacts that were produced and used, the roles that were responsible for the activities. We wanted to make sure that the definition used the 7 views approach, that it was compliant with standards, in this case 15288, and we wanted it to be easy to use, because it was a process set to use in universities and in training courses. Each of these use cases in the full process model, well, not each of them, but a lot of these use cases in the full process model are broken down a little bit further. And don't forget, they've all got descriptive text sitting behind them. We're not just looking at the just the names here. So the requirement context view. So like I say, this is now a view. This is an actual instance of a requirement context viewpoint for an actual set of processes, the STUMPI processes. What is the process or set of processes got to do? What are the requirements for it, and what are the stakeholders that are interested in that process? The process structure view is a bit of a weird one. The process structure view is about specifying the language that you use when you define your processes. We've already seen this. So the fact that we call things artifacts and activities rather than maybe work, product and task, that language is captured on the process structure viewpoint. And actually having that language defined is very useful for doing stuff like process mapping. So where you need to map your processes onto processes for another organization, or you want to map your processes onto processes defined in a standard, for example. The process structure view is the basis of doing that. Now, what that means is, in terms of the ontology, it's not actually things from here, from this diagram that it covers, because this actually is the process structure view for a set of processes. This is the language we use. So it's a little bit meta at this point. The process structure is actually on a higher level. It's about capturing the ontology and the elements and the relationships, the terms that are used in your process. So like I say, actually this diagram here with the process, the artifact, activity, stakeholder role, this actually is the process structure view. This is Scarecrow's process structure view. So the process structure is about capturing that language that you use in your organization. And for example, here's the process structure view for STUMPI. It's based on our standard one, unsurprisingly. but we've added types of process. So we've got the concept of engineering processes and management processes, and corresponding process groups. Management groups made up of management processes, engineering groups made up of engineering processes, and we've added in a whole set of stuff as well on the left hand side to do with life cycles and stages, and then groups of processes executed in those stages. So this is the process structure view for STUMPI. So like you say, you know, on for your processes, you might, for example, you might call that a work product. You might call that a task, and use the word, like I said, produces and uses. You might have 5 different roles there. You might have more groups. You might have a engineering process, management process. You might have stuff like acquisition processes and a corresponding acquisition group. So this is the language that you as an organization use when you talk about process and when you model your process. It's whether it is a task or an activity. Is it a work product or an artifact? Some people call them inputs and outputs. So this is about establishing the language. We're now going to start getting to the actual meat of things, which is the first sort of meaty view, if you like, is the process content viewpoint, and the views that we create based on it, based on the process content viewpoint. These is the actual processes now that you've got. It doesn't tell you how to carry them out, but it identifies the processes and names them. It identifies the activities within that process, and it identifies the artifacts that are produced and used or consumed by the processes. You can show relationships between them. There may be dependencies between processes, depending on how you structure your process model. There's often a big tension between having processes that are very dependent one on another. The problem with that, where you've got high dependency between processes, it means essentially you've almost got a single process, because if you always have to follow one process by another one by another one, you've really got just one huge big process. A more flexible approach is to try and decouple processes one from another as much as possible, because that then allows you to essentially sort of plug your processes together in whatever order is relevant for the work that you're doing at the time. But there is often a tension between them. So the process content viewpoint is about addressing the process and the artifacts and activities, typically not the stakeholders on this one. And you can focus on the process group levels, such process content view for STUMPI, that purely just identifies the process groups. And you'll notice, that we're using stereotypes throughout to show, which sort of concepts from our process structure view now. I'm not going to say ontology, our process structure view, the language, which concepts we're representing. Here's a much more detailed one. Here's a much more detailed one where we are looking actually at the processes within that process group. So we've got 5 engineering processes: stakeholder requirements, design, etc., etc. So the way we do this in SysML is we use a SysML block to represent a single process, and again we've got the stereotype on. We use the operations of the block to map onto or to capture the activities, and we use the properties of a block, or if you're using UML, the attributes of a block to capture the artifacts. So you can almost think of the process content view almost as you sort of reference your index, if you like. I can look at this and go, okay, I've got 5 engineering processes. Here they are. These are the kind of things that are carried out in them. These are the artifacts that are produced and consumed. Now, what you can do on here to take it to another level, and we do it generally when we model sort of full proper processes. You can mark with a stereotype or something like that. You can mark the artifacts as being in. So that's an artifact that's used by a process. You could have it as out, and that would be an artifact that's produced by the process, or you could do in out, and that's one that is it flows into the process, it's used by the process, changed by the process, and then produced, sent out by the process, if you like. So, for example, on the stakeholder requirements, the requirements set, the stakeholder requirements review, the document, the requirements set there, the individual requirements, they're all outputs, and the acceptance criteria and the product description and project description are input. So we can mark them on that, so that when you look at one of these diagrams, you can see which of those artifacts are coming in and which are going out. And what that means, actually, if you do it properly in a tool, is you can sort of make sure if you've got something that's, coming in from a process, coming into a process, well, you can see whether that's an output of another process. If it isn't, then you've got to check that it's coming in sort of externally to you, and that's fine. But if it isn't an output of a process and it isn't coming in externally, so where's it coming from? So you can use these in-outs to make sure you understand, how things are starting to flow. And as I say, you can put, dependencies between processes if you want. That's just to zoom in on a single one, just so you can read that. So as I say, you could have out on that, and you could have in marking that, just to give you extra information. And actually, to take it to another stage even further, you can also put those artifacts as inputs and outputs on the actual activities. So the identify stakeholders activity, for example, the output of that is going to be I'll just do SH for stakeholder, is going to be the stakeholder set, is going to be the output. So you can start to tie even more together on this diagram if you want to. The fourth viewpoint, we've been talking about stakeholders, so the fourth viewpoint is purely about capturing stakeholders. Peter, I'll come to your question in a little while, if you don't mind. Peter's asking, is there any reason not to use BPMN? I'll come to that in a moment. The stakeholder viewpoint is purely there just to capture your stakeholders. Make sure you've captured all of the stakeholders that are responsible for, or if you're going to use RACIC, all of the various relationships. So it's to identify all of the stakeholder roles that are involved in the processes. And again, it's just to make sure that you've got them. And we normally capture them as a block diagram like this. Again, with the stakeholder role stereotype, and we always use this sort of customer external supplier split. External tend to be things like standards and legislation. The supplier is sort of your side of the process. The customer side is people outside your organisation or outside your business unit that are essentially customers for the outputs of the process, or external stakeholders that have got to supply inputs to the process. When we get to the fifth viewpoint, and there's no sort of ordering on here, it's a fairly sort of random order that I've got them in here. But the fifth one, the process behaviour view, this is the sort of meat of the process, if you like. This is how you carry out the process. So each process on your process content view, each of these processes here will have an associated process behaviour view that shows you how you carry out the process. So it's covering all three of those areas now, and we would use SysML activity diagram. So it's showing this is for the design process. So we've got activities that are the activities from the design process. So they correspond to the activities on the process content view. We're using what are technically they're called object nodes. These square boxes. These are the artifacts that are flowing in and out. These are the activities. So those artifacts again will be exactly the same as in the process content view. And we start up here at the top, we finish down here, we've got a flow through, we're doing some stuff in parallel here, which is what the big black lines are. And importantly, you'll see we've got the swim lanes here, and they're the stakeholder roles responsible for those activities. So I can see in my design process, most of the work is the responsibility of the systems modeler, but the review of the design model, that's the responsibility of the reviewer role. So this one's only got 2 stakeholder roles on. Some processes have many more stakeholder roles on. This is a relatively straightforward process. But the beauty now is you can see the ordering of the activities, the order in which they have to be done. You can see the flow of the artifacts around the process. You can see which artifacts flow into which activities and which artifacts come out of which activities, and you can explicitly see the responsibility of the stakeholder role for the relevant activities on here. Peter was asking, is there any reason not to use BPMN? Not really in principle. I have to confess now, I haven't looked at BPMN for about, for about 10 years. The reason we didn't use it, the reason we don't use it in Scarecrow is that everything we do, we do using SysML. That's our strength. The reason prior to that we used UML before SysML came along, and the visualization is exactly the same. Essentially, they're classes rather than blocks. And again, the reason we did that at the time was there are more things. The BPMN is very good for doing something like this, like the process behavior view. It's very good for the flow of things. At the time, as I say, I don't know what's in the notation at the moment, but it didn't particularly support in its notation the capturing of the requirements or the sort of definition of the processes in terms of their content on the context view. But what you have to remember is the definition of the viewpoints you're seeing. So the fact that there's a process behavior view that has to cover that area there, or there's a stakeholder viewpoint that has to show stakeholders, that the ontology and the framework itself do not mean that you have to use SysML. You can use BPMN and text and whatever you want to realize the framework, to produce your views. We've got this view here as a SysML block diagram or a UML class diagram. You may represent your stakeholder view just in text in a table that says we have these stakeholder roles. On the customer side, we've got operator, sponsor, and user. On the supplier side, we've got these roles with a description. So you could do a completely text-based version of this view. You would still be conforming to the framework because you're still producing a stakeholder view. It just happens that you're not using SysML as the notation. So the BPMN, that's a realization question. It's why do we not use BPMN to draw the views? And the simple answer is we don't think it supports the views well enough. And everything we do anyway, we do in SysML. So why would we learn another notation? But there'd be nothing to stop you using BPMN if that's what you wanted to do. It's perfectly fine. And that goes back way back to one of the very early presentations, and throughout a number of the presentations we've had over the last 11 weeks, if you've sat in on them, where we've got our 3 packages diagram, and we've got approach, system, and visualization. We're talking about approach here on the left hand side of that 3 packages diagram, when we talk about the 7 viewpoints that you have to have instances of. The BPMN versus SysML question is over on the right hand side. That's purely the notation that you use. So yeah, so BPMN is completely fine. Nothing wrong with using that, but I think you'd probably find you'd have to use some other notation for some of the other views, but that's perfectly fine. The 6th viewpoint is the information viewpoint. This focuses on the artifacts that you've identified, and you can use this at a couple of levels. You can use this at a high level, essentially treating the artifacts as black boxes and capturing the relationships between them. And that's very useful, because one thing you can look out for then is, have you got artifacts that you actually can't really relate to anything? And that's a good sign that you don't need that artifact, or you're missing some process or activities. But when we go into organizations and we help them with their process modeling, particularly where the processes have been around for a long time, and we're trying to sort of formalize their documentation, there are many occasions where we've come across artifacts that have existed in processes for 10-20 years that nobody actually uses anymore. So the things get produced and it doesn't go anywhere. And doing these information views can really help with that. The other way that they can be used is at a low level, actually opening up the artifact and defining something about its structure. That's particularly useful for artifacts that are sort of models or documents, where you can talk about the sort of the sections that have to be in. So the information view is very much sort of focused over on the artifact side of the ontology. And here's a high level one for STUMPI. So each of the artifacts, again, I know it's an artifact because I can tell from the stereotype. This is a high level one where I'm focusing on the relationships between the various artifacts here. And here's the first level. I haven't taken it all the way down, but here's the first of them there. That analysis model document off here. So this artifact here, we're now breaking it down and saying, okay, it's got an analysis model in there. It's got some scenarios in there. It's got some interface specs that make it up, and it's got a list of assumptions. So you're starting to talk about the sort of actual structure of that artifact now, and each of these other ones could be broken down. These could be broken down further into parts, so you can start to use these diagrams to actually think about the way that you want to present the information or the artifacts that come out of your processes. What do you want an analysis model document to look like? What do you want a requirement specification to look like? Not in terms of, the typeface and the headers and footers, but in terms of the sections and how they relate to things. And then the final viewpoint that we have is a thing we call the process instance viewpoint. This is purely a sort of sanity check. This is about validating that the processes that we've defined, the way that we've defined them, actually does meet the requirements on the requirement context view. So this is tracing back the process, to its requirements. So it's looking at the process or a set of processes generally, and tying them back to the use cases. And for this, we'd use sequence diagrams. So we would produce a number of sequence diagrams investigating, how we can sequence our processes to address certain needs, and just checking that we've got all of the processes we need to cover all of our requirements on the requirements context view, and that, you know, our processes are potentially flexible enough to, you know, to move and you know, and plug in, you know. So for example, you know, if we're doing work that's, we're not implementing anything, we're only designing stuff, you know, can we just end at the design, or is it possible for us to verify and validate the design without having an implementation? So, you know, can we have a scenario that doesn't have the implementation operation process sitting there? So we create a number of these scenarios, and then they're never much more complex than this. But this is really just a sanity check, just to make sure that your processes actually do sort of work and fit together properly. And the things that flows, it might be a message for one thing that's kicking off another one like this, or it may actually be an artifact that's flowing from one process to another that kicks it off. And again, by putting artifacts on again, you can then start to look at the flow of information and the flow of the artifacts through a number of processes. So it enables you to make sure that, again, like I said, that the artifacts, you know, that are inputs to a process come from somewhere. And when you put them all together, you end up with the complete framework. So this is the complete 7 views or 7 viewpoints framework. So to reiterate, we have the requirement context view, which is essentially the requirements, the why. The why do we need the processes or process, and what do they have to do? We've got the stakeholder viewpoint. I'm going to say who. Technically, they don't have to be people, but who, you know, who are the stakeholders involved in or either, you know, carrying out the processes or consuming the results of the processes. We have the process structure view. So this is the language. This is the language that you use in an organization. And actually the process structure view should, you know, once you've done that, that should be the same. That language should be the same. You know, if you create a new process, it should still use the same terms like artifact, activity. We have the process content view. So this is what processes do we have? That's the process content view. And then you've got the process behavior view, and that's the how. That's how are they carried out. You've got the information view, so that's again about the artifacts. So that's about the relationships between artifacts and the structure of the artifacts. And then finally, you've got the process instance viewpoint, and that's the essentially the fit for purpose check. Okay. And so that's the sort of complete framework. Sometimes gets extended. So for some people, we add an 8th viewpoint on. So we'd have a viewpoint that's related to the stakeholder viewpoint that actually relates role fulfillment space. So we'd have a role fulfillment viewpoint that identifies who fills a role from the stakeholder viewpoint. So that means, because the stakeholder viewpoint is roles, it's not the names of people, but sometimes you want at a particular point in time to actually put names against those roles. Sometimes we do an 8th viewpoint to capture that for people. Okay. So unfortunately, time's up again. It goes very quickly. So we have a model-based approach to doing process modeling, our 7 views or 7 viewpoints approach. Like everything that we do in Scarecrow, it's based on an ontology, a framework, and viewpoints. It not only may be tailored, it has to be tailored for specific organizations, you know, in terms of the language that's used, but it exists to give you a consistent way of thinking about and documenting your processes, so they can be your business processes, they can be your systems engineering processes, they can be processes that a system has to deliver as part of its functionality, but it does it, in a consistent way with a set of viewpoints that are all related together, to make sure you think about, the what, the why, the how, the who, all of those kind of questions for when you're defining your process. It's deliberately intended not to purely just be the how. Many approaches or many documented processes, when you look at them, they're great. They have the equivalent of the process behaviour view, but they don't really say why the process exists. They don't have viewpoints to make sure the processes fit together properly, and that's when organisations start having problems. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us this week. I hope you found that. As I say, as usual, the video recording will be made available either today or tomorrow on our YouTube channel if you want to listen through this again, and the annotated PDF of the slides will be on our knowledge base, so you can go onto our website and get access to that if you haven't already. I hope, I don't know what we're going to be talking about next week, who can say. I hope you can join us next week for next week's talk, and if you're free in another 12 minutes, we have our social, which is basically just a rambling chat, sometimes about this subject, sometimes about anything, just depends what we feel like talking about. It's completely unstructured, it's a chance to ask questions or air opinions on anything, even tangentially related to MBSE. So hopefully you can join us for that in another 11 minutes.